So hi, Zach. It's a pleasure to talk to you. So Zak Stein is an educator and a philosopher of education, and it's also the author of a book, Education in a Time Between Worlds. And most recently, he's also a co-founder of a consilience project. So hi. Hi, Zach.
It's great. It's good to
Yeah.
talk. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I read your book in, well, February 2020. And before that, in late 2019, I applied to this conference. It's Teaching for Life. So I've been at an attendee of this conference before. It's for educators, maybe it's like 300 most active, or let's say passionate, or kind of active educators in Slovakia. And it's like a three-day conference. And actually in 2020 it was supposed to be held in March, but then the COVID broke and it was actually postponed twice, but maybe more on that later. But it was dedicated to 350th anniversary of death of John Amos Comenius, so who you know well as a friend. And so thank you very much for your time. And also it was a great book, and thanks to the conference, I had the opportunity to reread sections of it and listen to some podcasts with you and check my notes. So, yeah, maybe if we could get ready into some questions. So maybe, how do you see your book, or predictions of your book, or the core message in light of the current pandemic?
Yeah. I mean, I wrote the book, between 2015 and 2019, basically, and it was published in 2019 in January. But I actually have a scenario in the book where I suggest, well, what happens if schools get disrupted, right? Like in the book, I say maybe it'll be a climate crisis or an economic crisis, but at some point the buses won't run and the cafeterias won't serve food. And what do we do then? And the whole thing, the whole notion of the book, the time between worlds notion, was a notion about civilizational collapse or civilizational transition, depending how you want to characterize it. And so in that sense, the book was, and of course, I didn't know the pandemic was coming, but I knew something like it was coming because there are so many systems. In this case, it's the medical and political systems that I believe are being the most stretched. But there were other scenarios where it's the financial system or the ecological system or supply chain systems. And all of those started to get shaky too when the pandemic hit. And all those same scenarios still could unfold. So I was tracking that and suggesting that we needed to build a much more resilient educational system that's not like schooling. And that is as different from what we know as schooling as we know it was from the thing that came before it, which is the whole Comenius story, right? Like the school systems Comenius was imagining were so fundamentally different from the school systems that existed, let's say in the preamble to the 30 Years' War. You could say the school systems actually produced the 30 Years' War. You could say we're so different from what Comenius was envisioning. And so I'm suggesting there's a comparable world system transition that's underway. And we need to think about the future of educational systems beyond schooling. And so I propose these educational hub networks, which are basically what tried to self-organize during the pandemic. The schools shut down. They sent out this like hub and spoke network of little pop-up classrooms in every household. Right? So that every house becomes a schoolroom. And I was basically saying every neighborhood could become a community-run part of a community-run educational hub network. So had the infrastructures I was proposing been put in place prior to the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, we could have flipped a switch and dropped into another like backup generator, if you will, like a different off the grid kind of, meta modern educational hub network. So I it's always when an author writes something that is like this, and then something comes to pass that kind of makes it seem true, you don't feel good about that. You know what I mean? Because you're like, this is what's happening is very complex and very dangerous. We're in a very, very kind of out of control situation. And some of that has to do with the inadequacies of our educational systems to meet the demands that are being placed upon them by the increasing complexity of the problems of society, if you will. So that's, I guess, would be my answer.
Yeah.
You know, please.
Yeah, I like the metaphor of backup power generator. It's literally what, it's a great metaphor. Because it's like in a sense, COVID is like the power went out, but it was like the health went out instead of power, you know. So like who knew that so many things are predicted on actually healthy societies without some transmissible diseases, and so it's like a switch went off and suddenly you can't meet people. So it's a great metaphor. But you also mentioned in other places, like I like this power generator metaphor a lot. You also mentioned that what actually happened is like the screens have won and the schools have lost during COVID somehow, if I'm correct. So maybe you can elaborate on that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the arguments I'm making in the book is that digital technology has outpaced schooling, which is like that before the pandemic hit, it was already the case that screens were winning and schools were losing, that the whole modality of schooling was kind of being made obsolete by the ubiquity of information due to the ubiquity of the personal computer, which is to say the screens are everywhere. Screens are literally embedded in our everyday life. We bring them to bed with us. School's just this building that sits there for 6 hours a day where we actually don't use screens in an intelligent way. Like the kids are actually using the screens more sophisticatedly at home, talking to their friends than their teachers know how to use them in school. So you're kind of going back in time when you go into a normally run school. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are amazing schools that are keeping pace, but I'm talking about large, typically state-run schooling systems, large bureaucracies, basically. The American school system in particular exemplified by, let's say, the New York public schools, which is probably the largest school district in the world, I would imagine, but maybe not. And so the issue is that schools were already basically being made obsolete, and the pandemic accelerated that by like 5 years in about 5 months. It was all of a sudden it became clear, oh my goodness, like there's a way to actually run this whole thing differently. And I think for better and for worse is the point. So the idea that screens win and schools lose could be a bad thing. It could be a liberating thing, a wonderful thing. So it's about what we do with that fact. But first we have to admit that fact, which means that mainstream, large-scale educational reform can't focus on just fixing the schools anymore. We have to admit that the schools are so outpaced by the technology that we have to reinvest in education in a different way. And so this comes to the technological back end for something like this distributed educational hub network, which would be a backup generator that's actually more efficient than the grid. So it's resilient if the grid goes down. But once we have built it, then we actually are safer if we disconnect from the grid and run this thing. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to happen for a truly distributed educational hub network to fit the demands of the society, including these other social miracles I discuss, which also were accelerated by the pandemic.
Yeah, like the basic income guarantee kind of happened in many
exactly.
countries.
Again, for better and for worse. So I think a lot of these trends accelerated.
But the core point, if I understand, is that it's the design is key. It's not only about like some technological progress as such, like let's say more screens or more screen time or cheaper smartphones. But if the services are optimized for time spent on site, as Tristan Harris says, like let's say on social media, and not on time well spent on site, or let's say on learning, like some, if we could have some metric is a you don't like maybe the word metric here, but like optimize for something different, like for quality of life or quality of learning or something.
Yeah.
And so it's
Okay.
not.
Yeah, the technological, so basically it's saying digital makes schools obsolete. Step one. Step two is something like the current form of digital is completely inadequate and actually winning predatory. It's winning for the wrong reasons. It's winning because it's like an addictive drug. So the idea would be to admit that digital outpaces schools and then commit something like a Manhattan Project level investment in education, in thinking about the digital as an educational medium, not a profit-making mimetic warfare medium, an actual educational medium, in which case the ratio of screen time to in-person time would flip. And this is my main argument about educational technologies, is that Khan Academy and YouTube and these things are just actually the pre-digital paradigm on steroids. It's just the VCR with the Nova special with volume turned up, but there's 1,000 channels, right? So it's like, it's broadcast, but it's multiplied. It's not actually doing what the digital does best, which is network and encode memory and enable extended mind. So that's a complex way of saying what we could do, and this is the back end for the education hub network I recommend, is you build a very complex time and skill sharing network, right? So that the educational technology is actually a networking technology that enables real people to get together in real time and space, but it's very complex. So what it does is it takes a community and it says who has what to teach, who has what they want to learn. All of that's put together and it outputs, right? These teachers, these students in these places, you create pop-up classrooms where you do education. Maybe screens are used there, but the whole point is that the digital doesn't need to make it so that we sit in front of a computer and that's how we learn. The digital could actually make it so that we find one another in actual time and space to have educational experiences we couldn't have had without the digital networking technology. So the main fix is actually to move away from the model of the Skinnerian, when B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, the Skinnerian learning box or the Skinnerian learning machine where you sit in front of a computer and it just feeds you information. That's Khan Academy. Like that's YouTube. That's the main modality. If people think digital education, they think huge inventories of videos that people watch, basically, or like other things where they maybe have chat rooms and they talk together, something like that. It's like, no, man. What we need to do is use these things to create self-organizing educational communities that make the implicit, hard to find educational relationships that are in a community explicit and easy to find. So that if there's a guy who wants to teach piano and there are kids who want to learn piano, that's easy to do. And the state supports it the way it's the state support a school. So there's a longer conversation there, but yeah, digital technology as it stands is anti-educational. It's actually a means of informational warfare and profit extraction.
And propaganda or entertainment, as you call it.
Correct.
Yeah. It's and also we could go many places with this, but like your core thesis is that education is a intergenerational transmission of knowledge or capabilities, and so the all crisis or the current global meta crisis is like a crisis of education. And you mentioned elsewhere that also like journalism, for example, is one example where there is like maybe the combined with social media and these predatory aspects and kind of decrease of quality of media, media becoming more like tabloids or something like that. But it's also a problem of education or intergenerational transmission of knowledge or ethos between the older generation of journalists and the younger, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it foundationally, is to say that's why I can say something like schools are dead, but education is in a renaissance, right? I can say something like that because education is more basic than schooling. Education is a species-specific trait that involves very complex intergenerational transmission of culture and cultural artifacts, tools in particular, and tooling. And so that's how I define it. It's like, I also talk about social autopoiesis, right? So if you know dynamical systems theory, autopoiesis is the work the organism does to stay itself. It's the self-making or self-creating capacity or function, the autopoietic nature of the organism. So societies have to do a certain amount of work to reproduce themselves and to stay being the same society, to stay being the same civilization. So education is the most basic thing, which means it's much broader than schooling. I'm a Deweyan, like a John Dewey follower in that sense, where he defines it as, most of the major institutions of a society are educational. And of course, the family is the primary one. And of course, it was Comenius who pointed this out way back in the day, with the school of infancy and the mother and the family being the primary metaphor of what education needs to be at all higher levels of institutionalization. So there's a deeper way of thinking about education than schooling. And what that allows you to do is look at how digital technologies could help us or hurt us in terms of, are we accomplishing intergenerational transmission or not successfully, right? And so if you look at the work of like Margaret Mead and other people who started to trace the existence of a generation gap, which is to say an increasing misunderstanding and misalignment of motives between generations, a lot of this has to do with technological change during generational change, right? So it's like, as technology becomes almost exponentially transforming, the generation gap is going to inevitably get wider and harder to maintain. And so that's something we need to track as educators, that it's actually harder to be truly an educator now than it was, let's say, pre-Enlightenment, right? And then it's harder now than it was post-World War II, because the environments of socialization, right, the places where kids are growing up, are saturated with a completely different kind of communication technology. So it's just, it becomes very important to keep your eye on intergenerational transmission and let the old institutional forms fall away and somehow maintain connection between generations. And there's some things that make that hard to do. Technology is one. And then things like corruption and other factors make it difficult to pass on one, like civilization, like to pass it along. How do you pass it along if it's deeply corrupt? Right? It's hard to do. So that's, I think I'm tracking that. And right now, as we've said, the digital technologies are working against intergenerational transmission when they need to be used in favor of intergenerational transmission. And so comparable to bring in Comenius again, to the context of the 30 Years' War, where the use of the printing press in particular as a tool of propaganda was just like refined, like it was remarkable. The extent to which the printing press, which was an innovation that was not a military innovation, right? It was a cultural innovation, was used for militaristic power purposes. Now, Comenius steps in, and Comenius writes a series of textbooks for teaching Latin, right? The Orbitus Pictus being probably the most famous one, but there are several other ones of the gates of language, where he innovates literally at the level of technological printing press innovation, where the use of a picture and the descriptions of the picture and the juxtaposition of the two different languages allowed for a completely novel educational affordance for a text. And so he flipped the script on the propagandistic use of the printing press and basically said, what we can do is use the printing press to do something that's almost inevitably educational. Like, it was such a powerful innovation. Like, every royal family taught their child Latin using Comenius's textbook. This is what allowed Comenius to go around all the royal courts and be already, his reputation preceded him. It was translated into Russian and China and Iranian and all of this stuff.
It was like the first widely used children book or something like that, right?
And they call it now a children's book, but it was in fact a very powerful tool for teaching all ages to read Latin. But my main point there was that it was the same technology that was escalating conflict by saturating urban environments with pamphlets and posters and propaganda. That same tool was used by Comenius to saturate the aristocrats with learning. And that's what allowed the kind of constellation of the invisible college and eventually the turning over of one civilization into another civilization, which is what occurred, the birth of what we now are seeing ending, the kind of capitalist world system. So that's an interesting lesson. So as bad as it is with the digital technologies now, it is precisely in those technologies where the future of education resides, but it doesn't look like a kid sitting in front of a screen at all.
Yes, so it's like the argument against naive techno-optimism, that it's kind of, there is some kind of Hegelian synthesis of like opposites, like, okay, so technology can be used for bad or for good, but it's not, but the design is important as well. So you can use knife for surgery or for killing someone. So, and bigger knives or more knives doesn't necessarily mean more progress or something like that.
Right, but there are some technologies that are obviously designed as weapons.
Yeah. Okay.
like a bomb, for example, is a dangerous thing to have around, even if you're using it as a paperweight. Right. So, and similarly, like with Facebook and some of these other social media platforms, it's like, no, this is designed basically from the ground up in the wrong way. And so the sense that like technology is neutral and it's what we do with the technology, it's not exactly correct.
Not always, of course. Yeah.
Not always. It's very clear that some technologies are basically always going to be bad.
And also quantity has some its own quality when it's like really on a big scale. But what I like about this one example, it's I forget the name actually, but something like biocarbon engineering. Yeah, that's the name of the company, and they repurposed drone technology for planting trees for like maybe 60 something times faster than people can. And okay, maybe this is one small example of like radical repurposing of, let's say, military technology for planting trees, which is nice. It's kind of similar to what Forrest Landry and his kind of way of thinking, like maybe we should use technology, like humans using technology to repair the planet. So that might be maybe one of like just like a side note there, that it's possible, but I guess it's rare, these kind of examples. I think we need more of them. But you mentioned Margaret Mead and like 3 different cultures elsewhere, like some pre-figurative, configurative, post-figurative, if I remember it well. But basically, your idea of or the phrase and the metaphor of a time between worlds is very like poetic and very nice, but it has also some kind of like a technical meaning that you already mentioned mentioned with the 30-year war, John Amos Comenius being a refugee during that war, a religious refugee, as well as educator, and he used the technology of printing press. It was like a paradigmatic technology that brought Enlightenment and brought maybe French Revolution and Napoleon. If like this big history of reading of Alexander Bard and these information paradigms, we can if we take it into account. So, but you're using this time between worlds in a also technical sense, in like two different kind of ways that go deep into like a complexity theory or big history. So maybe if you can maybe shortly elaborate it, and maybe then we should get more into John Amos Comenius.
Totally, yeah. I mean, Amos Comenius is relevant because he represents a figure who lived in a time between worlds the way you and I live in a time between worlds. And, the notion came from two different convergent perspectives on big history, which is to say two different perspectives on like the long duration of human history. So whole centuries, many hundreds or thousands of years of history told in one narrative. That's like big history. Two different ways of telling that. One was Immanuel Wallerstein. He is a world systems analyst, very good economist and economic historian. And then the other was Jean Gebser, who's a historian of culture. And both of them posited that there were kind of, and you already used the phrase like epochal, which means like major world historical changes at the basis of the organization of civilization and culture. So it's a complex statement, but these are structural analyses of the way that economies run and technical infrastructures run, and the way that cultures run and like mimetic architectures are maintained. And the time lapse are interesting, which is to say that the stages in Gebser's model of civilizational cultural unfolding and the stages in Wallerstein's model at a couple points line up really interestingly. And one of those is during the 30 Years' War. This is the beginning of what Wallerstein sees as the capitalist world system, where you get a change from the ancient regime, right, where you had a feudal empire and the divine right of kings. And then in a relatively quote unquote short period of time, you get the Enlightenment, you get the birth of scientific organizations and the end of the divine right of kings and the beginning of capitalism and democracy. And we know that story, right? And so that's Wallerstein documents that and then says during the capitalist world system, there have also been shifts, major rollovers in the dominant hegemonic power that runs the capitalist world system, beginning in Venice, going to the Dutch, then eventually to the British Isles, and then to the United States. And the question is, what's next? What's next? And Wallerstein asks that question. And similarly, Gebser says, yeah, there's been these transformations from the magical to the mythic, to the rational, to the aperspectival, which means the non-rational, trans-rational. And then he asked the question of what's next. So both of them posit that we are in the context of a world historical transformation that's at least as profound as the one that was occurring when Comenius lived, which is the move from a pre-capitalist to a post-capitalist world, from a divine right of kings to a democracy world, from a no science to a hegemony of science world, that it's that big of a shift. Or it's as big as like the Bronze Age and the emergence of urban life from tribal existence. So I'm not sure which of those it is. There's another theory that it's actually as deep as, let's say, like
multicellular organism.
Right, like it's actually an evolutionary transformation that it's like
from single cell to move to,
from single cell or from pre-hominid to post-hominid, what Teilhard de Chardin called the hominidization or cerebralization, the birth of all at roughly the same time of all of these Homo sapien species, and then we emerge as Homo sapiens sapiens. So the point of it is that there's major transformation underway, but it takes time. Like, it's not that it just happens. So there's a period of time when the old world it no longer exists. The basic assumptions of how those cultures and infrastructures and economies run no longer hold, but the new world has not formalized, right? That we don't actually have new infrastructures and economies or new cultures, right? So that means there's a space in between where there is both worlds existing at the same time and neither of them existing. So this is the time between worlds. It's a time between historical epochs. In theological terms, it's a time when God is absent, right? It's a time because God is the order. It's a sense of order. The sense of heaven is in order and earth is in order. So when God is absent, then you get the mixing of heaven and earth together, and you get this period that's full of potential punctuated equilibrium in evolutionary terms, right? It's a time that's potent for self-organization and evolutionary change. And so there are going to be attractors within the space, which are already the parents of the future. So like, it's worth noting that many people during the 30 Years' War ended up going to Amsterdam. Like the intellectuals, many of the Invisible College to Amsterdam and to England. With the Civil War happening, it was more complex, but you end up getting Comenius is there. It's where he dies. It's the center of the use of the printing press for non-propagandistic purposes. And it's the origin of the Dutch East India Company, where Comenius dedicates his main work, his main pedagogical work is dedicated to the Dutch East India Company, which is an example in the time, in the time between worlds, he's actually seeing that's the future. That's one of the things here. Like, it's not the royal courts and it's not the Pope and it's not Luther. It's this Dutch East India Company, which is actually running a model of economic organization as different from the feudal system of economic organization as the educational system Comenius wanted to pitch and move forward was from the existing feudal educational system. So he was actually seeing that his large nationwide public education system for all kids, teach all things to all people in all ways, like that was possible through something like this Dutch East India Company, which wasn't having any of this bullshit that the royal courts were engaging in, like crazy mythical debates about heaven and the body of Christ and all. Like, as mystical as Comenius was, he wasn't hung up on that stuff, which causes religious wars, right? He was very interested in what allowed people to collaborate at a higher order, at planetary scale, in ways that unite people and cause peace and learning. And so it was just interesting. And so similarly today, there is a need to be able to discern in the time between worlds what's a remnant that it actually needs to be allowed to die and pass away, and what is a harbinger of what's to come. What are the positive seeds and parents already existing of the future civilization, and how do we direct key energies towards those seeds of the future? And in the space of education in particular, as I've been saying, I think we need to look at the generator backup off the grid style community run hub network and high-end rethinking of digital technologies, like very like resource intensive, government funded, like private public collaboration towards really rethinking digital technologies in the interest of helping children, not giving them brain damage and identity confusion, which is what's happening now with digital technologies like en masse. So it's actually urgent for many countries as a national security issue, because the state of the adolescents and younger people under 12 is so dire from a mental health perspective that they won't be able to man armies or staff businesses. Like it's that severe of an educational crisis due to the disruption of the educational technologies and the totally unregulated interface between the adolescent brain and the asymmetric AI technology manipulating the attention of that child. So it's just like, it's a crazy situation. It's comparable to when huge coal conglomerates in Dickinsonian England put young kids in coal mines. You know what I mean? It's that how do we let this happen? Like, oh,
Yeah,
capitalism is this out of control.
it's like thousands of PhDs, psychology PhDs working for these social media companies, let's say, trying to optimize the AI, and as Daniel Schmachtenberger says, it's the AI is like thousands times stronger than the AI that has beaten Kasparov at chess, right? So, and you are a single person there trying to, I don't know, look up a tweet, and then you realize, oh, I spent half an hour like just in an emotional, I don't know, yeah,
it's
like like
it's a kind of mind control technique. I mean, it's like, anyway, it's a longer story about hypnosis and sensory overwhelm and the manipulation of the amygdala and subliminal messaging. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that is now basically part and parcel of being online as a young person, and as we're susceptible to it too. But I'm speaking mostly about the child welfare element to technology regulation. So yeah, and again, like that's one of those things in the time between worlds, you know, which of these technologies is actually just some weird holdover from this prior way of doing business, which is what I think a lot of what we're looking at. It's like, oh, we're just going to continue to extract resources, but the resources will be people's attention and sanity instead of like coal or wood. So that model, a la Zuboff's surveillance capitalism and others who've looked at techno-feudalism, that the dominant modality of social control and extraction, like that we're moving technologies that could be used to create a very different future into the capture of the past. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's because again, like education, it's not placed in a vacuum, or it's you need, as you mentioned, these or outlined these certain social miracles that need to happen for, let's say, some step function, or from a humanity or education going like from a caterpillar to butterfly, kind of from the scarcity model to the educational abundance model, let's say. Then you need like loads of contexts to kind of change slowly or faster than slowly, but so yeah, and similar to this technology, predatory, let's say, predatory digital technology, it's based on the shareholder model, or fiduciary, not fiduciary duty, but the actually not, it's the fiduciary duty here is absent, so, and there is duty only to shareholders of those let's say public companies to turn on profit, right? So okay, and maybe the stakeholder capitalism is not enough to make it or to change it somehow. We need a deeper change in technology, and also in design, or in ethical, social technology or psychotechnology.
Yeah, and again, it's Comenius saw it coming, right? Like his ultimate vision, the pan-Sophic vision, resulted in a program of universal reform. Education was the top of the things that needed to be reformed. It's like superstructure reform would create reform of governance, which would then create reform of economies or infrastructures, right? So you kind of saw this stack where you had infrastructure, social structure, superstructure, if you will. And the main point there is that right now, technology infrastructure, communication infrastructure, is running of its own autopoietic, self-replicating, out of control, profit maximizing, not constrained by culture or ethics at all. Right. That was not a great sentence, but I think you got what I was saying, that right, we don't have a social structure, we don't have governance or a philosophy of ethics that could justify that governance, that could actually bind that infrastructure, that could actually hold Facebook accountable, and then make an infrastructure that would actually serve the purposes of governance and well-being, right? And so Comenius saw that you couldn't reform the education system without reforming religion and politics and economics, like full stop. And he's like, we actually have to have a program of universal reform in the interest of placing education as the most important human endeavor. And this is an idea that I had before I ever encountered Comenius. And then when I encountered him, I thought I was I dropped everything and basically was obsessed with Comenius for 6 or 8 months. And it's this notion that, in fact, right now we're kind of in idolatrous situation. We're kind of worshiping something that we shouldn't be worshiping, which is the maximization of economic growth. Comenius believed that we could build a society where all of our shared cooperation was in the interest of pursuing further human development. So it was literally an education-centric, human development-centric society, where profits weren't kicked back into making more profits endlessly, that profits were kicked back into making better humans endlessly, so that you had a kind of an autopoietic dynamic within the society that actually overall increased the quality of the society, and specifically the people in the society. So he had this vision of a new way of understanding the relation between basically governance and education and religion. Markets, right?
Yeah,
also, several moving pieces. Yeah,
it's like the government should check the predatory aspects of markets, and educated population should check the government so it doesn't become corrupt or just like just captured by oligarchy or some special interest.
Yes, and this was the Comenian vision. I mean, his most famous book, the Labyrinth of the World and the Paradise of the Heart, right, which is like a parable of his journeys through this kind of like post-Babel insanity, and then the solution to it, the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, more or less, disguised in the book, ends up being just that, the possibility of something emerging within a space that's fundamentally corrupt, a new way to regulate the earth. Right. And so, Comenius was a Christian. And so his notion of preparing the way for a world sovereign is kind of an interesting notion. And which is to say, the kind of political apparatus he imagined and the kind of educational system he imagined was a model of governance that was not modern. Like this, and this is where I think after the Enlightenment, much of Comenius's thinking was brought into the education system, but they jettisoned and they left behind a lot. And this was that he actually had, I would call, a meta-modern vision, which was post-secular, which allowed for the infusion of sacred value into human concern, like politics and economics. And so the splitting apart of religion from governance and religion from economics is something that emerged after the 30 Years' War. It's part of the Enlightenment. But it was something that Comenius was basically working to augment. He would basically say, you want to differentiate those things. They're different. But at the end of the day, we need a society that has a sacred value on human life, not a legal value. There will be a legal value, but the superstructure, the ideology, the philosophy of the civilization needs to be one that's basically post-secular, which is a wrinkle in the Comenian philosophy of education, which shouldn't be overlooked. And it's an argument that I make, is again where I see eye to eye with Comenius, which is that when I lay out the characteristics of the future educational system, I say it needs to be post-secular. Doesn't mean it needs to be Christian. Doesn't mean it needs to be religious in the classic sense, but it needs to be conversant with those dimensions of human experience that speak to the sacred and that allow us to actually justify social structure that can bind infrastructure, right? What's the moral and ethical and religious capstone of the civilization downward propagating from which are the motivations and identities of the people who carry out the governance and build the infrastructure. The ultimate justification system, first principles and first values, is what we're kind of talking about. And so that's where Comenius put the chicken in the right position in front of the egg, which is to say the first conversation we have before reforming everything, which is what he thought the world was ending unless we reformed every institution. But the first conversation is the conversation about education. It's about how are we sure that we have our heads on straight and that we can work together to continue to keep our heads on straight and to learn enough to then work to reform other things. So similarly with climate change or corruption in government or economic reform, it's all great. But if you're working from a fundamentally wrong foundational conception, which is to say, if your philosophy is wrong, if you're miseducated and you're not in a context where you can be properly educated, then you will undertake the wrong environmental plans. You'll do the wrong economic reform. You'll do the wrong carbon capture thing. So the mind and the crisis of the mind is the meta crisis before the other specific crises of infrastructure or social structure. There's the superstructure crisis, the crisis of the mind, of sanity, and of capacity to learn or incapacity to learn. And one of the general ways you can evaluate a social system or a person's health is the extent to which it has positioned itself to continue to be able to learn or not. And so if you have built up an identity that makes it so that you have to protect yourself from learning to maintain your identity, that's not going to last. And similarly, a society can get to certain points in the way it regulates the fourth estate and the press and the media and the way it regulates its academic institutions, where the society can no longer adequately learn. It's lost its capacity to learn. Ideally, democracy, this is a kind of Habermasian idea, supposed to allow societies to continue to go on learning and actually upgrade their capacities for learning. In the absence of democracy, you can get downgrades in the capacity for the society to learn as a whole, and sometimes localized little epistemic bubbles of people who think that just a small group of powerful elite can somehow learn enough to regulate the whole society, but that's naive. So then they're like, well, we'll build an artificial intelligence who can do it. That's worse. Yeah. So the pressing need for forms of open society that enable collective intelligence to upgrade our society-wide capacity for learning. Again, a very Comenian idea. Because hardcore Comenius was basically saying that in the 17th century.
Yeah, it's like not prioritizing the state or markets, but community first. Maybe putting community first. It's some kind of like a positive feedback loop or a victorious circle, or how you call it, virtuous circle, where maybe community shouldn't be sacrificed at the expense of markets or the state. And so maybe some technocratic elite is not enough. AI.
Specifically, it's communities of inquiry or communities of learning. That's specifically this. It's not just everyone gets together and feels happy and yay, we're in community. Like it's you know what I mean? Like it's a specific kind of community where there's a epistemological commitment to sanity and like clear intergenerational transmission. So it's an educational community, which would be necessary to form and to maintain prior to any political or economic adventures of reform.
Yeah, I wanted to tie it back to the notion of the sacred or the post-secular. So I'm not sure if I understand it well, but okay, this is somehow quite maybe abstract, but it's like this first person view versus second person versus third person. And for me, it's kind of more subjective. It's when it's connected with like local communities, small scale, like you mentioned, bioregionalism or bioregions, like a natural scale of actually existing region where there is a river and there is some kind of trade and like some kind of agriculture around, let's say, that river, and there are some natural boundaries and let's say some small communities, and how to connect this like bioregion scale community to, let's say, a cosmopolitan vision. So it's something like rooted cosmopolitanism as this notion. I'm not sure who came up with that notion first, but it's I like this phrase. And so basically not just to be some kind of technocratic elite, like people of anywhere, but let's say to be rooted somewhere, or be more, let's say, rooted in two places or more places. So to be a person of everywhere, or not just a nationalistic person, but let's say rooted in a small local community, but also having connections and cooperating globally with some other people. So have this kind of planetary, ecological, or cosmopolitan vision, but at the same time, don't be just like some consultant who can fly from one country to another, not rooted anywhere. But okay, maybe I'm too off here. But just wanted to connect it, the notion of sacred and community vis-a-vis markets and the state somehow.
Yeah, and again, we'll return to the 17th century, right, which is so instructive because and I write about this in my book, in the 13 Social Miracles, where I talk about redrawing the national borders, right? Even the very idea of a national border is something that emerged in the 17th century. What we know of as the nation state didn't exist. The lines that we have on the continents, especially the continents of like Africa and elsewhere, those lines were not drawn in the 17th century at all, not even close. And so what we know of as places, quote unquote places, right, or countries, right, these are fairly recent, in some places very recent constructions, right? Like, so that's the first point, which is that what we come to take these things, when you look at like a globe or a map, and you come to take them as like they're almost written on the earth, right? But if you go up into space and you look down on the earth, only in very few circumstances, usually due to military buildups, can you see the actual line between countries. So if it's a national marker, it's a river, you see the river, but you don't, that doesn't tell you that this side is these people. So these lines that we've drawn around national borders, and this is particularly true in your part of the world and in other places, where it's like, how do we deal with these, right? So the blood and the soil and all of that with these borders. And so then people go too far in the other direction. Like, well, we'll erase all the borders and we'll all be one planet, one people. And you're like, well, that's incredibly naive and actually a frightening totalitarian scenario, right? So what's the middle ground? And you're expressing it. It's a bioregional cosmopolitanism that's sensitive to the unique stories of peoples and the people and their land. Right. And so that's a lot in that statement, which includes a whole thing about indigenous peoples. And there's like all of this stuff in there because of where did the land come from and the stuff. So at the end of the day, I do propose that there are naturally existing regional enclaves, which could create multiple, really numerous, unique places, which would have reasonably internally coherent infrastructures, supply chains, and other things. So you'd have a relocalization and a doubling down on place. Like in Vermont, there's a saying, like a hashtag, like a Twitter thing, hashtag Vermont can feed itself, right? Which is nice. Like there's enough local agriculture and enough awareness of the affordances of the bioregion. Like you don't come to Vermont to grow oranges, right? Like, so you know what grows. So there are affordances that regions could have, which could allow for unique schooling, unique infrastructure, unique, places in the global economy. That said, we don't want a re-tribalization where we are limited only to the affordances of our bioregion and therefore susceptible to famine, drought, etc. So there's this balancing act where, as the nation states become increasingly irrelevant, Mostly their militaries are the reasons that they remain relevant. Economically, noetically, meaning culturally, there's a whole bunch of other things that are emerging, including even just through the movements of the market or relocalization of certain supply chains. The pandemic did this in particular. So yeah, so I'm predicting the emergence of something like a bio-regional cosmopolitanism, which will be structured initially like a kind of techno-feudalism. This is where it gets weird, because remember I said the nation states become increasingly irrelevant, which means that exercising of policing and protecting of infrastructure and a whole bunch of other things are going to start to be actually offloaded from nation states into private hands, at least in the States, in the United States. We're already seeing this. So it's interesting. Just like in the 30 Years' War, never would have been able to predict that these nation states would emerge, that there'd be this whole continent cut up into sometimes perfectly square states, like in the middle of the United States, completely arbitrary fiction of a geometry, basically. Could never have predicted that. So similarly, likewise, the future of the way that the cosmopolitan civilization that's trying to emerge is organized, what that looks like, I don't know. But I do know that the nation state's becoming increasingly outdated, just like its school systems. So there's a need for a return to certain kinds of resilient, local, specific, as long as you keep the hidden universal, as long as you keep, and this is the difference, like it's not a re-tribalization, or what they'll call disparagingly for your part of the world, like a balkanization, like this is right, like that's a disparaging word. My family is from Yugoslavia.
I heard it actually on some podcast. Like actually today, I think in the morning, I couldn't sleep. So it's two in the morning or 3. I was listening to, I think maybe Global Futures Project or something like that. I don't know where you said it, because I listened to like 2 or 3. And so okay, you're from former Yugoslavia, so balkanization is I know the word.
Exactly. So that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that the scale at which we're trying to operate, the scale at which we're trying to homogenize, which is the scale at which we're trying to make everything the same and make everything work in it, it's not.
I mean, this is another another topic where it's for maybe a whole podcast or something, but it's one of the maybe most important chapters in your book, or I mean, not most, interesting, or how to say it, like you had a separate lecture on it, I think, for Ronin Institute, if I'm correct, about measurement. It's and it was fascinating. Maybe most fascinating is the word, but of course I liked all of them, but I reread just parts now. But the measurement, and because you mentioned this global harmonization, or maybe I mentioned it, but you meant it like kind of homogenization, sorry, pardon my English. I thought that this is a problem, like this global harmonization of like everybody has to, we have the saying in the post-communistic Slovakia, everybody has to write with a blue pen. So it's like from one song, if you don't write with blue pen, you're like, I don't know, dissident, or if you are sticking your head up, it will be cut off. So everybody just needs to be nivelized, leveled up, but I don't know if it's a correct word, but so this global harmonization can be a problem. I mean, I think we've seen it also in COVID, where there is not enough space for different, maybe small countries to do various parallel experiments, or just like to do go their own way, trying different things. But no, you need to have some super state or multinational, I don't know, organization saying, approving it, let's say. So it's not, I mean, it's okay. This is one example of what you describe in this measurement?
The global crisis of measurement, I describe it. Yeah, I mean, I a few things to say. Like, I discovered the problem just by looking at the problem of standardized testing in school. And in the United States, standardized tests became the be all and end all of schooling. They became the main way that schools ran. And what I started to look at when I was looking at standardized testing was actually the application of a decision-making procedure to education, which had already been applied basically everywhere else, which is put a standard in place, put a measure in place to see if the standard was reached, and then change the system based on a measurement-enabled auto correction, right? Which makes sense if you're building cars or something in a factory, right? That you would have measurements in place to allow for on-the-fly quality control improvements based on measurement-enabled objectification of work process, right? Great, like Taylorism, going back to like the 1800s, like this is how modernity functioned, right? And there are many areas where that type of efficiency-oriented, measurement-intensive quality control.
Six Sigma,
yes,
I don't know.
That makes sense in a whole many areas. But as soon as you start to apply that in the regulation of humans, let alone learning in educational environments, you are going down you're taking the wrong approach. Not that there isn't places for assessment and measurement in education. There are. I innovated in the design of standardized tests. I think there's actually many, many places where testing is necessary. But the simple decision procedure based on those kinds of tests that was being imported, as I started to see that was a general problem, I started to realize that like there's a really big mess that we've created involving the over application of this way of thinking about the use of measurement, and particularly in psychometrics, but also in other areas of human life where we need other ways to think about issues of scale and quantity and standardization and those kinds of factors. So it led me down this whole rabbit hole of looking at the International Standards Organization, which is the ISO, which is like
ISO. Yeah.
It's remarkable because it's, people say there's no global government, and there is no global governance. Like the UN is not a global government. But the ISO is the closest thing to a global government. It actually regulates a whole bunch of what's called soft laws. They're just regulations. They're not technically legal codes, but affecting almost every single supply chain and major industry. The ISO sets the standards for the size of a shipping container, sets the standards for the size of a credit card, right? Like so many specific things that make the world system technically interoperable and allows for vast, complex things to take place that otherwise couldn't take place. But in that process,
this is maybe the distinction between complicated and complex. Just like it's over complicated, maybe then, but not complex enough. Meaning like it's maybe too rigid and set in stone. But let's say it's like the airplane is a complicated product but the airplane cannot repair itself. But let's say a bird or a human being, it's like you have this autopoietic or self-repairing tendency. And so maybe OECD is another, like, or UNDP, OECD. I'm like in this kind of, I work in this area, and I see like you mentioned that this is like if you are leading, or if you come up with new measurements, or if you are the one who is like proposing these kind of soft laws, or how to call them, so regulations, it's kind of a way how to get power. And actually I can see it. It's true, because I can see a lot of actors. I also work or I have been working in this area of sustainability or corporate, CSR, corporate social responsibility, or how you call it today. So like and blended finance, development finance, these kind of things. And you see various actors like OECD wanted, they want their piece of cake, so they come up with their framework, which is like a meta framework, including all the other frameworks, but like kind of hinting that they want to be the boss. You know, it's kind of like maybe not really, but you see this kind of funny play, like everybody comes up with their framework, and they will of course recognize the others, but they also want kind of like hello, we are here and we will tell you how to do things.
Totally. And the point is that the framework includes a system of standards and a set of measures to see if people are meeting those standards, right? So it's like if you represent a bunch of people who harvest coconuts in Thailand and you want to make some like sustainably harvested coconuts, right? It's Sustainably Harvested Coconut International Certification Organization. Okay, so we're coconut farmers who just created an organization to certify ourselves in some rule that we just made up.
Yeah.
This is the idea. And that happens all the time. It's one of the things that happens in educational testing too. You build a curriculum, you want to show the curriculum works, you make the test that assesses the curriculum, and then you show that the curriculum works, right? And you're also doing statistical analysis, right? And we can see, of course, in COVID, in the pandemic, the way measurement, biometric measurement, has interfaced with political decision-making across the board and actually laid the groundwork for sweeping changes in the use of biometric infrastructures for regulating human behavior, which is something I also predicted in the book. And so, yeah, we're looking at an over-measured or hyper-measured world where everything that moves is basically measured. And what's interesting is that, and you made the complicated distinction, which is exactly the right one to make, where something complicated is usually built by humans, can break, cannot repair itself. Moving parts, tons of moving parts, hundreds of thousands of moving parts, but they're all interchangeable, replaceable with ones. Organic things are complex, things that humans don't make, like humans. Humans don't make humans. Humans give birth to humans. Yeah. But they don't make humans like a complicated thing, like the way humans make robots, right? Humans make robots. Robots are complicated. If you have a complicated thing and you measure it, you can actually comprehensively measure a complicated thing. Like all the gauges on the plane are sufficient to give you an understanding of the plane because it's built, you know exactly how it works. Most organic things, I would venture to say, definitely all things beyond mammals, and so especially humans, you cannot exhaustively measure them in order to predict behavior. I mean, this even happens with hurricanes and other complex physiological phenomena where eventually it's so complex that even if you have you think you have comprehensive measurement of it, you still can't predict what it's going to do. So the exhaustion of measurement as a technique of understanding and control, that's what I'm pointing to with the measurement crisis paper, which is to say modernity brings us so far. And this is back to the Comenian time between worlds. Time between worlds also means end of one scientific paradigm, but haven't yet begun the next scientific paradigm. So right now we're encountering, and Morton speaks to this with the hyperobjects notion, right? The hyperobject. The hyperobject is the thing which shows to science the limits of science. Right.
It's like the computational irreducibility or something like that.
Computationally irreducible, exactly. And so no matter how much you measure this thing, you can't exhaust it. And it's not because you don't have the right measures or the sciences or you're making mistakes. It's because the thing's legitimately too complex for your little scientific methods to handle.
And if you are measuring it, it keeps changing somehow as well. Maybe.
Yeah. And some of the things like human systems have immeasurable qualities. Like full stop. Like there's a whole domain of things which escape technical measurement, which can be evaluated and assessed and judged like we do to one another, but not quantified, specifically not quantified without a very important remainder to the extent that you shouldn't have even have measured it because the remainder is more important than what you measured. So that's another factor is that.
Or subjective experiences like seeing the sunset, as Daniel Schwarzenberg mentioned.
Like, do you want to measure the beauty of the sunset? Like, just asking that question is a bad question to ask. What what would you do? You'd set up some Likert scale, and would it be phenomenological? Is it an objective? You know what I mean? It's just foolish. Or measuring the intensity of love. You can speak metaphorically about doing that, but it's very different from, say, measuring the distance between two people, right? Physically. So yeah, but our success, interestingly enough, in physical measurement, and again, back to the Enlightenment and what happened after the 30 Years' War, one of the things that was occurring in Comenius's time was widespread, what I would call metrological injustice. So injustice as a result of non-standardized physical measures. There was a huge issue in the feudal world, was unjust weights and measures, right? One of the things that the French Revolution and the metric system did was just fucking cut that shit out. They were like, nope, one measure for all man for all time. One measure for all man for all time. And that solved one kind of problem. It meant if I went to that
meter, I read that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. But it meant that if I
anchor it in some kind of planetary scale, I don't know, something with equator or I forgot. But then they didn't manage somehow. So it was arbitrary at the end.
Yes, it ended up being arbitrary. But it was imposed universally, which meant that if I went from this town to that town and I got a liter to drink, it would be a liter, you know, or whatever.
But it wasn't the king's food then. It was
not the king's food.
It was scientific. It was suddenly
supposed to be scientific, and it was supposed to be geocentric or world centric. So that it was supposed to be a sub part of a radian of the whole circumference of the earth. Anyway, but the point is that that was a major advance, like the birth of objective measurement and the political history of quantitative objectivity as an instrument of power. A lot of that was good, but again, what we've done is overextend the applicability of that decision-making procedure. So now that we're using those kinds of things on things that we just shouldn't, like complex systems that we do not understand well enough, like the way pandemics work, for example. Like we're trying to solve a complex problem with a complicated single intervention.
Yeah, just one intervention. It's like either or kind of thinking, you know, like this modern or I don't know.
And that's how
postmodern as well. Yeah, either or. Yeah,
complicated work that way. Like an airplane, one missing part in an airplane engine, and it's not working. It's like it's either or. But complex systems can often work under states of extreme compromise.
And various, it's like scalars or in various configurations, and it can work like this way, that way, and there is a great diversity in approaches. They might result in a similar results, bring similar results. Right.
Keep going pretty soon, so
you have to go. Soon, Okay. Cool. Oh, it was a blast then. I don't know. Wanted to bring it back to I with the measurement. Maybe I like the idea of the story that you actually had a company or was an organization that came up with some new kind of new metrics or standardized testing for schools. But then there was a lady in one meeting where she told you that she represents real estate interest in this town, and actually the real estate prices would fluctuate too much if you come up with new metrics of standardized testing in education. So it was quite fascinating. Yeah.
and that's the lesson learned from the measurement issue, is that if you want to change a huge system, change the measurement that they're using to regulate that system, right? It's a big lesson. Like if you measure something different, the whole feedback dynamic changes. And so right now we mostly value economies based on the GDP, right? Gross domestic product. Like that seems to be like the main thing. It's kind of like if you were worried about your health and all you cared about was your weight. Some people are like this. All they care about is how much they weigh.
Yeah.
If they're weighing less, then they're getting healthier. And if they're weighing more, they're getting unhealthy, irrespective of all the other things that you could be measuring, right? And so similarly with GDP, we think we're getting better because GDP is going up. But in fact, it could be getting a lot worse, even though GDP is going up, which is what's happening right now in the United States because of the disconnect between the finance and actual economy. But that's another issue. The point here is that you look at one measure, you focus only on it, and you optimize for it, and you're definitely messing up other stuff, like sometimes irrevocably. And so, yeah, with standardized testing in particular, because of the weight that was put on the standardized test, and this lady was mentioning like real estate, house prices, right? Whole city blocks and neighborhoods. Like, can a company relocate to a city and recruit employees to come live in that city or not? That depends on the standardized test scores used in these schools. Like, so the simple measure gets so much weighted on it that you have, in Atlanta, Georgia, the largest cheating scandal in the United States history, which is orchestrated from the superintendent down in collaboration with business leaders in Atlanta who just wanted Atlanta to look like a place to come live. They wanted Atlanta to look like it was a good city, and yeah, so yeah, if you can manipulate measures, you can manipulate power and do a ton of stuff. And so the dynamic relationship between measurement and power and mathematics and violence in particular, those things form this cluster. So that's why whenever you're looking at new regimes of measurement, you're looking at new forms of power. And so that's what you're seeing with the pandemic right now. Yes, it's a rollout of medical technology, but we're also seeing a rollout of new ways of gating and measuring human beings as they move through space and time. And so that means that we're looking at a new mode of social control based on a new regime of measurement, in this case, biomedical. But biomedical is actually serving as a proxy for socio-political economic. So that's where it gets dicier.
It's like also Illich, even Illich was writing about this, and he also has this unschooling society, this kind of approach. Maybe just to finish on a positive note, because you have to go and I don't want to keep you. I'm a bit tired as well, but I would like to keep you, of course, another hour, but then maybe next time, some other time, if we are lucky. Or if I'm lucky, but I mean, you mentioned these distributed educational hubs, and so just to give you some examples from Slovakia, we have actually also, like, I think it's 2 schools now, like it's like abandoned schools or something that were recreated by community. One was actually artists that escaped, or they were like they had to move because of higher prices from the city center. They went to a periphery, and there was like this abandoned school, and they kind of recreated it. So it's like different communities. Also kindergarten is starting there. It's in my town, but it's okay, this is kind of normal for big towns. But there is also a mining town, which is like much less developed, which also has such a school now being recreated by a local community. So of course you have these kind of examples. And also there are some, like one is called like Zaježova community, also like they have their own like kind of they just a bunch of people 20 years ago came together and started living in some village, and now actually the real estate prices there are quite high,
going up
in the middle of nowhere. but it's not based on a single metric, like the kids are having good scores, but they build their unique culture, and also a great educational spot. It's like a village incubator or something where businesses even come for lectures. So
that's the your part of the world actually gives me hope sometimes in the future, because you guys have been between worlds for a longer time than most of us. And so there's all these places where, precisely because the old institutions aren't quite working correctly, there's opportunity, right? There's opportunity that the school is empty. Why is the school empty? Like there's a mistake was made somewhere if there's an empty school. And similarly in the States, like in places like Detroit and other places that are just like urban wastelands now, you're seeing farming and agriculture and these types of communities taking back over the responsibility for schooling and education. And so that's, again, one of my main hopes is that, if you look at patterns of civilizational collapse and you look at prior civilizations that have collapsed, you find that dynamic of basically in the wilderness or in the places where the old system breaks down, creates like a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushes stuff. Sometimes it's bad, right? Like if policing withdraws from a city, that's a vacuum and crime rushes in. But if education withdraws, and if often what the formal education withdraws, then what rushes in is the informal education, which sometimes, if those schools were bad, is better than what was already in place, right? So that's the idea, is that it's precisely COVID broke open the possibility in the United States to start to dismantle the school system and to start to build something a lot better. Now, it's been a mess, and so a lot of kids got hurt, but there are also pockets where it's been really liberating for some communities, some teachers, some students. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that the model that I proposed, I've heard echoed back to me by people who'd never read the book, right? Like you're saying, these artists who just did it, because what I'm describing is a kind of like instinctual reaction that humans have to education as a phenomenon. Again, not to schooling. Schooling is this modern invention, thanks to Comenius and others, that was really appropriate at a certain time. But education is deeper, species-specific trait for which we have instincts, like strong instincts. Like if you look at refugee camps, some of the first things to pop up in refugee camps are schools. Like they're not schools in the way we think of them, but they're parents getting together, putting the kids in one place, putting someone who's very responsible in charge and doing something like teaching whatever their religion is or teaching whatever they need to teach, right? So similarly, I think as the situation becomes more unstable, which is what I see happening, from like a single polar to a bipolar to a multipolar complex geopolitical craziness happening, in the gaps, in the breakage, in the breakdown, new life springs out. And so I think that education will be one of the places where that happens in some really profound ways. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen everywhere. Like they're like already we're seeing in the United States profound negative impacts from the pandemic on childhood development, like worse than I had anticipated, in terms of suicides and numbers of kids on psychiatric medication and that kind of stuff. But I think in other places, it still may be possible to pull something together. Anyway, so that's my attempt to end on a note of hope, which is that there's a resilience built into the human, specifically around the instinct of education. And so we need to like free our minds from allegiance to those institutions that are dying and find a way to get in touch with the instinct to educate, and just have situational awareness and just do that,
and focus on neighborhood and not just homeschooling in front of screens, but at least a couple of people getting together, like a couple of parents, couple of educators.
That's the instinct, because you look at a kid in front of a screen as a parent, you're like, this is not enough. The instinct is like, this is not right. The kid's 6 hours a day in front of a screen. The instinct is to get other kids, multi-age kid groupings with responsible parents, with rich materials and environments. Like that's the instinct, So, all right, brother, I need to run.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Contact me again. And again, I guess, from America, this is like a Comenius, like Comenius' spirit is alive. I'll say that.
I learned so much about Comenius. I honestly didn't know much. It's a shame.
Didn't know. I went through 8 or 9 years of graduate school in philosophy of education at fucking Harvard, where he was invited to be the president, and I never heard of him. And I had to discover him through researching the Rosicrucians. Basically, that's how I discovered Comenius. So anyway, he's a world historical figure, and to honor him on the 350th I'm honored to be a part of it.
He's big here. We have a Comenius University in my town. He's big,
Yes,
but
no,
I didn't
like I
know.
said.
You told me, or you showed me so many interesting things with the Dutch company, the East India company. With I mean, lots of things. So thank you very much for your time and for this talk. And hopefully we see each other or write each other or something sometime.
Yes, no,
again
welcome that.
soon.
And likewise, people contacting me who see this, I welcome emails if you can give out my email.
And they should check the Consilience project, which is an attempt at meta news and kind of bringing some educational renaissance, I guess, of, for maybe you can have a one-liner better than me, but
no, that's pretty good. Yeah, it's good writing. It's good writing on the state of affairs and a lot of what I was speaking to. So yeah, you can link to that as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
So take care and have a nice day and evening still. Bye.